President Traore was about to discover the hard truth that many leaders of smaller nations eventually face. Real independence in the modern geopolitical world is an illusion unless you're prepared to fight for it. The balance of power never truly favors small countries. They're often forced to choose a side, east or west, in a global tug-of-war masked as economic cooperation. It all began during what appeared to be a routine economic cooperation meeting with representatives from China. The event was nothing unusual on paper. Burkina Faso regularly engaged in such bilateral discussions with international partners. But this time, something felt different from the moment President Traore stepped into the polished, air-conditioned conference room of the presidential palace. The Chinese delegation, led by Vice Premier Li Wei, welcomed him with the usual pleasantries. 3 technical advisors accompanied the vice premier, their laptops open and presentation materials spread neatly across the long table. The setup was clean, professional, and impressively organized. It was everything Traore expected, and yet much more. Li Wei opened the session with calm confidence, thanking the president for his time and explaining that they had development proposals to present. As the projector came to life, charts and graphs began to flash across the screen. High-speed rail networks linking major cities, massive solar power facilities, telecommunications upgrades, and manufacturing hubs promising to generate tens of thousands of jobs. Then came the number that silenced the room: $2 billion. That was the size of the development package China was offering over the next 5 years. It was nearly twice Burkina Faso's entire annual budget. The scale was enormous, even shocking. Every chart, every projection, every timeline had been carefully calculated to impress and persuade. The technical advisors laid out construction blueprints, employment statistics, and financial models in front of him. It was clear this proposal was not thrown together on short notice. It had been planned meticulously. Vice Premier Li Wei leaned in slightly, adding that this would be China's largest single development investment in West Africa. They were prepared to begin construction within 6 months of signing the agreement. But there was a catch. There always is. As Li Wei advanced the slides, the tone shifted. In return for this unprecedented investment, China expected exclusive access to Burkina Faso's lithium deposits, some of the richest in the region. Chinese companies would be given preferred contractor status for all government projects, and the country would host China's West African Coordination Center. President Traore understood immediately what was at stake. These weren't just development projects. They were strategic investments that would give China deep control over key sectors of his economy. The lithium rights alone represented untapped wealth that could reshape the country's economic future. Handing them over exclusively would mean sacrificing long-term sovereignty for short-term gain. He asked a simple but critical question: what about our existing international partnerships? Li Wei maintained his diplomatic poise, but delivered a pointed message. China preferred to work with countries that maintained focused, singular international alignments. Too many overlapping partnerships, he warned, created unnecessary complications. The message was clear: choose China or risk losing this opportunity altogether. President Traore thanked them and requested time to consult with his cabinet. The Chinese gave him 2 weeks to decide. It seemed generous, but the clock had already started ticking. As he walked out of the meeting, he was still digesting the sheer scale of what had been offered. The infrastructure projects, the jobs, the investment. It was everything his country needed. And yet, it came with chains he could already feel. Tightening. But Traore didn't yet realize how calculated the timing was, or how closely his every move was being watched. Just 3 days after that meeting, the American delegation arrived. Led by Deputy Secretary of State Jennifer Matthews, the team included trade advisors, security experts, and development officials. The meeting had been officially labeled a routine bilateral relations and economic review session, but Traore quickly noticed it was anything but ordinary. Matthews began by acknowledging the time-sensitive nature of the discussions and thanked the president for meeting again. Then, without any ambiguity, she revealed that the United States was fully aware of China's proposal. Her tone was confident and assertive. The U.S., she explained, was prepared to counter the Chinese offer with a different kind of partnership, one that emphasized sustainability, transparency, democracy, and long-term security. While the financial commitment was smaller, $500 million in direct investment and an additional $200 million annually through guaranteed market access for Burkina Faso's agricultural exports, the Americans stressed the qualitative benefits. Technology transfer, democratic institution building, cybersecurity support, and even military cooperation were all on the table. These weren't just financial deals. They were ideological packages wrapped in strategic alliances. Matthews moved swiftly through the presentation, displaying images of American development successes across Africa and sharing data that painted the U.S. as a trustworthy, long-term partner. Then, like the Chinese before her, she laid out the real cost of this generosity. To qualify for this partnership, Burkina Faso would have to participate in U.S.-led counterterrorism initiatives, restrict the use of Chinese technology companies in sensitive sectors, and align itself with America's regional security framework. In short, the U.S. wasn't offering to help Traore's country grow. It was asking him to pick a side. He asked what would happen if Burkina Faso chose to maintain open relationships with multiple international partners. Matthews's expression hardened. In today's complex global security environment, she warned, that kind of neutral balancing act had become increasingly difficult. For countries to benefit fully from American programs, exclusive cooperation in key areas was a requirement. And then she dropped the final demand. Traore would need to make his decision by Monday, just 5 days after the Chinese meeting, with their 2-week deadline still counting down in the background. That night, President Traore sat alone in his office, surrounded by folders, economic reports, and intelligence briefings. He wasn't just choosing between development deals, he was staring down a geopolitical trap. The pressure was mounting fast. The Chinese offered unmatched financial firepower, but at the cost of sovereignty. The Americans proposed ideological alignment and governance support, but demanded loyalty in return. And neither side was willing to share. Traore called an emergency meeting with his top ministers, finance, defense, and foreign affairs. It was time to look deeper. Something didn't feel right. Why were both superpowers offering deals within days of each other? Why was there such urgency? Foreign Minister Ouagadougou had already done his homework. He revealed that the timing was no coincidence. The American embassy had clearly known about the Chinese proposal ahead of time. Intelligence sharing, surveillance, and diplomatic observation made it easy for the two embassies to monitor each other's actions. This isn't economic competition, Ouagadougou said grimly. It's a coordinated chess game, and we're the board. Defense Minister Traore examined the security angle. The American deal involved counter-terrorism alignment and exclusion of Chinese tech. The Chinese deal came with its own restrictions, quietly undermining American influence. Both sides were offering control in exchange for allegiance. Finance Minister Cohn, running the numbers, came to a blunt conclusion. Accepting either deal meant forfeiting flexibility and long-term economic autonomy. We'd be putting all our eggs in one basket, he said, a basket that comes with handcuffs. President Traore sat back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He had prepared for this day, or something like it. The moment when Burkina Faso would have to choose whether it wanted to be someone's ally or stand on its own. He stood, eyes burning with quiet determination. "Gentlemen," he said, "it's time to activate our alternative strategy." President Traore had never believed in miracles. He believed in preparation. For over 6 months, he and a small, trusted circle had quietly been crafting what they now called the third path. It wasn't merely a counter-strategy. It was a declaration of independence wrapped in strategic collaboration, a rejection of false choices, a bold refusal to be carved into someone else's empire. But that weekend, the heat intensified. The very next morning, as if on cue, the Americans returned. Deputy Secretary Matthews requested an urgent follow-up meeting. Her tone was sharper now, less diplomatic, more pointed. The pleasantries were shorter. She wasn't here to renegotiate. She was here to apply pressure. "Mr. President," she began, setting a thick folder of classified documents on the polished table, "we have intelligence you need to consider. Urgently." Inside were detailed assessments of Chinese overseas infrastructure projects, maps with red circles and arrows, photos of Chinese-built coordination centers in Africa and Southeast Asia. Embedded within the technical data were warnings, explicit and ominous. Matthews leaned forward, voice low and serious. "In every region where Chinese development centers are constructed, intelligence activity increases. Surveillance capabilities are embedded. Civilian projects double as military infrastructure." She paused to let the implications sink in. "Countries that accept such partnerships," she continued, "often find their sovereignty gradually eroded. One contract at a time. One compromise at a time." The message was simple. Choose China, and Burkina Faso might wake up one day to find its own government surveilled and its alliances compromised. The U.S., she claimed, was not just a development partner. It was a protector of freedom, stability, and rule of law. Then she added the final line like a dagger. "Mr. President, there are consequences, real ones, for nations that destabilize existing regional security arrangements." Traore nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Deputy Secretary. Your concerns have been noted." But even before she left the building, another request had already arrived, this time from Li Wei. That same afternoon, the Chinese vice premier returned, but his tone was noticeably different from Matthews. Where the Americans brought hard edges and unflinching demands, Li Wei wielded calm persuasion. He chose suggestion over confrontation. "Mr. President," he said smoothly, "we understand that international relations come with challenges. Some nations may attempt to interfere with what should be mutually beneficial cooperation." He slid forward a set of charts comparing African countries that had embraced Chinese partnerships versus those that hadn't. On the surface, it looked innocent: economic growth, improved infrastructure, job creation. But beneath it was a message as sharp as any weapon: align with China and your people prosper. Align elsewhere and you stagnate. He referenced case studies, hinted at GDP projections, highlighted countries that struggled after yielding to external political pressure. It was soft coercion, hidden beneath courtesy and numbers. Then he said something that made Traore pause. "There are many paths to prosperity," Li Wei said, "but some are blocked by those who don't want you to succeed, unless you succeed their way." It was a subtle jab at the West, but also a warning. Choose America and expect quiet retaliation from the East. Traore walked out of the meeting more convinced than ever. Neither of these giants was offering partnership. They were offering dominance, wrapped in smiles, dressed in suits, delivered through PowerPoints and diplomatic decorum. But he had already made his decision. As dusk fell that evening, President Traore convened his most secure communication network, one that had taken months to establish. Through encrypted video calls, he connected not with superpowers but with equals, the leaders of India, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, the UAE, and multiple African heads of state. Their video feeds flickered into place, one by one. Some spoke English, others French, Portuguese, Arabic. but their message was the same. We're ready. Traore addressed them with measured strength. Friends, we knew this day would come, when global powers would force us to choose. But we are not chess pieces. We are players. It was time to activate the full plan. Phase 1. The Global South Cooperation Initiative would be announced across multiple time zones. A joint declaration from nations across Africa, Asia, South America, and the Middle East. The initiative would reject exclusive partnerships in favor of multilateral cooperation. It would prioritize shared development, independent financing models, and reciprocal knowledge exchange. The initiative was not just a political move. It was a strategic realignment. And it had teeth. India would offer technological infrastructure support, including 5G rollout and renewable energy expertise. Brazil would contribute advanced agricultural technology and food sustainability programs. Turkey would provide light manufacturing and defense industrial cooperation. The UAE would back the alliance with sovereign wealth funding and financial management infrastructure. South Africa would lead mining and raw material optimization. And Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso would be the heart of it, the symbolic and operational center, the proof that a small, landlocked country could shift global currents if it dared to think beyond its borders. Traore didn't wait for Monday. On Sunday night, final details were approved. Legal frameworks were signed. Coordinated press releases were prepared. And at 9 a.m. Monday morning, instead of choosing between two superpowers, Traore invited both of them back. Separately. He received Matthews first. She arrived expecting confirmation of allegiance. She left visibly rattled. The United States proposal is thoughtful, Traore said firmly, but Burkina Faso will not trade one dependency for another. We choose independent cooperation. We will work with many, not one. Before she could protest, he calmly handed her a sealed document, Burkina Faso's formal diplomatic response, affirming their intent to proceed with multilateral partnerships through the new Global South Initiative. America's offer, he said, remained welcome, but not on exclusive terms. Next came Li Wei. The size of your offer is impressive, Traore acknowledged, but our country is not for sale. We will partner, but never pledge loyalty to a single master. Again, he presented a formal response, respectful, firm, final. Both delegations left the presidential palace dissatisfied, warning Traore of repercussions, lost opportunities, and future uncertainty. But by midday, the storm had already broken. 17 African countries publicly signed on to the African Independent Development Alliance, the regional wing of the Global South Cooperation Initiative. Press conferences rolled across capitals from Lagos to Kigali, from Accra to Nairobi. News feeds lit up with one bold message repeated again and again. We choose cooperation without domination. Traore appeared live before a Pan-African media audience, standing beneath the national flag. His voice was calm but resolute. We welcome investment, but we reject submission. We welcome partnership, but we reject control. Today we show the world that Africa can speak in one voice. Not east, not west, but forward. The world was stunned. Within days, the geopolitical landscape began shifting. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a revised statement offering development support without exclusivity requirements. The U.S. announced updates to its African programs, pledging to support Africa's independent growth models and emphasizing flexible cooperation. And it had all started in a quiet conference room in Ouagadougou. 6 months had passed since that historic Monday. The world had not ended. Burkina Faso had not collapsed. In fact, something extraordinary had happened. Nothing and everything had changed. In the eyes of the global superpowers, President Traore's decision had been audacious, reckless even. A country of under 23 million, surrounded by land, poverty, and instability, had told both East and West the one thing they weren't used to hearing. No. Not a conditional no. Not a hesitant, we'll think about it. A firm, calculated rejection of geopolitical submission. And yet, instead of descending into isolation or becoming a cautionary tale, Burkina Faso had emerged stronger, more confident, and now more followed in its footsteps. By the end of that 6-month span, the African Independent Development Alliance had grown to 22 countries, a mix of resource-rich states, small agrarian economies, and those historically viewed as too unstable to lead. Now, they were part of something larger than themselves, a continental pact of economic solidarity. At its heart was the Global South Cooperation Initiative, a multilateral framework built from the ground up. With no American security strings, no Chinese mining claims, and no European austerity conditions. It was raw, new, fragile, and untested. But it was theirs. And Traoré? He had become more than a president. To some, he was a visionary. To others, a threat to the global order. But to most Africans watching closely, he had become something rare, a leader who didn't flinch when both giants knocked at the door. Global media outlets had tried to spin his decision in different ways. Western analysts criticized the risk of over-diversification. Chinese officials quietly accused him of aligning with anti-Beijing coalitions. Some world leaders labeled his refusal to commit as diplomatic immaturity. But the people of Burkina Faso saw something else. They saw a man who didn't sell their future for $2 billion. They saw a president who hadn't buckled when foreign intelligence files were dropped on his desk like threats. They saw a leader who chose vision over fear. Under the alliance's framework, Burkina Faso began implementing sector-specific deals. India, as promised, led the rollout of solar microgrids in rural provinces, powering villages that had never known electricity. In return, Burkina Faso opened its universities to Indian engineering faculty, creating a South-to-South education exchange program. Brazil deployed agricultural experts to transform low-yield farming zones into high-efficiency food belts using regenerative methods. Burkina Faso, in turn, offered access to underutilized agro-processing infrastructure to support Brazil's food export routes to North Africa. Turkey contributed equipment and training for light manufacturing, helping establish Burkina Faso's first domestically produced tools and appliances line. This effort employed thousands, primarily women, across the country. Turkey gained access to distribution hubs to sell their goods deeper into West Africa. South Africa, leveraging its experience in mining regulation, sent legal teams and geologists to help Burkina Faso draft long-term sustainable mining laws, ensuring that when extraction began, it was local workers, not just foreign companies, who benefited. The UAE, through a sovereign wealth vehicle, helped Burkina Faso establish its first indigenous national investment fund, structured to channel portions of mineral and export revenues back into education, clean water access, and transport infrastructure, without relying on IMF conditionalities. And it worked. Not perfectly, not instantly, but undeniably. Foreign observers noted that Burkina Faso's growth rate had stabilized. Inflation remained manageable. Unemployment, especially among youth, began to trend downward. Infrastructure projects, once stalled for years, moved forward with unprecedented regional cooperation. Even skeptics began to admit something was happening in West Africa. Meanwhile, the Chinese and American approaches started to shift, quietly, then publicly. Beijing returned with a new ambassador and a drastically revised development offer. The tone was different. Gone were demands for exclusive mining rights. Instead, China proposed to co-invest in lithium extraction alongside the Burkina Faso National Investment Fund. Shared profits, shared oversight, shared control. Washington responded in kind. A U.S. delegation visited the capital with updates to their Africa programs, this time emphasizing flexibility, local governance support, and non-exclusivity clauses. The Americans also proposed cybersecurity assistance, but this time, it came without conditions regarding foreign technology bans. In private, some officials grumbled that Traore had set a dangerous precedent, one that, if repeated by other small nations, could upend traditional diplomacy. But in public, they adjusted. The old rules had cracked. By the one-year mark of the alliance, other countries, outside Africa, began requesting observer status. Small island nations, Southeast Asian economies, even Caribbean states with colonial legacies still weighing them down. All of them were watching Burkina Faso closely. Traore was invited to address the African Union, then the G77, then the BRICS Plus Summit. Not as a follower, but as a voice. In every speech, he repeated the same philosophy. The future is not East. The future is not West. The future is what we build with our own hands, in our own image, for our own people. It wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a doctrine. One evening, sitting in his modest office, Traore reflected aloud with his cabinet. "You remember the day Matthews laid that file of intelligence on my desk?" he said, hands steepled, eyes distant. The ministers nodded. "She thought I would be frightened," he said, "and for a moment I was. But then I realized, fear is how they keep us small." There was a long silence. Then Foreign Minister Sawadogo leaned forward. "We're not small anymore." And they weren't. Burkina Faso had joined the family of nations not as a pawn, but as a partner. It hadn't become a superpower. It had become something rarer. A country that knew its worth. Traore often told his advisors that their greatest success wasn't rejecting America or China. It wasn't even launching the alliance. It was proving that dependency is not destiny. And while critics still argued about long-term sustainability, one thing had become undeniable. The narrative had shifted. Small nations had seen proof that it was possible to say no and still survive, that you could build your own table instead of begging for a seat at someone else's. One international journalist, reporting on the alliance's one-year anniversary, summed it up best. "When two giants fight over you, the greatest power isn't choosing sides. It's proving that you are worth fighting over. And better yet, showing that you don't need to be fought over at all." As the sun set over Ouagadougou one warm evening, school children walked home on newly paved roads funded not by Chinese grants or American loans, but by a coalition of southern nations bound not by ideology, but by shared struggle and rising hope. And in the presidential residence, a man once underestimated by the world sat at his desk, signing into effect a new education initiative. This one funded by alliance surplus revenues, not foreign aid. He smiled quietly, not because the fight was over, but because finally it was his fight. And this time, the world was watching him.